The British had reason to regard the rebellion initiated by the North American colonists as treason. The British protected the North American colonies in front of the French, and they also bore the high military costs of that war. So, they naturally believed they had the right to charge protection money on this land. As for the colonists' cries over no representation, or the democratic slogan no taxation without representation, the British ruling elites merely saw it as unreasonable fuss. After all, in 18th century Britain, not all taxpayers had the right to vote. Whether you were in London or Boston, the North American colonists certainly had their own reasons for resisting. They left their homeland for the New World, in pursuit of freedom and wealth. But if life here was no different from that in Britain, wouldn't their journey to the New World be meaningless? And when conflicts could no longer be settled by words alone, the only obvious choice left for both sides was to take up arms. In May 1775, all 13 colonial states fully attended the Second Continental Congress and passed two important resolutions. One declared the colonists' right to take up arms in resistance, and the other was a petition repeatedly reaffirming allegiance to the British king. Of course, these revolutionaries did not expect that two resolutions would peacefully resolve the issues. In anticipation of a potentially larger war, the Congress decided to form a real armed force to counter the British Army. Subsequently, the Continental Army, the predecessor of the U.S. military, was established. The independent militias of the various colonies were brought under the unified command of the Continental Army. The capable and highly respected Virginian, Representative George Washington, was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The British also responded to the resolutions of the Second Continental Congress. In August of that year, King George III issued a proclamation to suppress the rebellion, declaring the North American colonies to be in a state of insurrection, and that Britain would marshal all its resources to crush it. The enormous gap in strength between the revolutionary forces and the British Army was clear. In fact, when the battles of Lexington and Concord broke out, the revolutionary forces didn't even have a single cannon. If one had to point to any advantage the revolutionaries held over the British, aside from fighting on their home turf, it was probably their stronger conviction in their cause. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, was a public expression of colonial sentiment. Initially, most colonists believed that this was merely a rebellion to eliminate internal inequities within the British Empire, rather than a war for independence. The two resolutions passed by the Second Continental Congress, though completely different in tone, actually reflected this popular sentiment. Paine's systematic arguments in Common Sense on the legitimacy and necessity of independence seemingly enlightened the colonial people, prompting a broad turn towards supporting the war for independence, including many conservatives and opportunists. Common Sense sold astonishingly well in North America at the time. Within 3 months of its publication, it had sold over 100,000 copies. After the outbreak of the War for Independence, both the revolutionary and British forces vigorously sought the support of indigenous peoples and colonists in the Quebec region to bolster their war efforts. The revolutionary forces even issued proclamations to Quebec twice, attempting to persuade them to join the fight. But since they failed to gain Quebec's support, and to prevent any cooperation with the British, the revolutionary forces began in September that same year to split into two columns and invaded Canada by force. At first, the Canadian campaign went smoothly. By November, the revolutionary forces had captured Montreal, a key city in Quebec. But by December, the revolutionary situation turned drastically, and during the assault on Quebec City, the revolutionary forces suffered heavy casualties under the command of the seasoned Brigadier General Richard Montgomery also fell in battle. May 1776, the British forces defending Quebec received reinforcements, eventually forcing the revolutionary forces to retreat, securing the victory. And during the Canadian campaign, though the revolutionary forces were defeated, the British missed a great opportunity to restore order in Canada. The British left half of their forces to garrison the area. Meanwhile, the revolutionary forces, having caught a brief respite, began shifting their focus to the southern campaign. As early as March that year, the British, to prevent further losses during the siege of Boston, which had continued to escalate, withdrew to Halifax and waited for reinforcements for nearly a year. The siege of Boston, which came at a great cost to both sides, completely dashed any hope of a peaceful resolution between the colonies and Britain. By July of that year, a break with Britain had become inevitable. Meanwhile, to eliminate internal factional disputes within the revolutionary forces, and to resolve the growing anarchic chaos in the colonies, the revolutionaries decided to form a collective leadership body representing the affairs of the 13 colonies. Subsequently, primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson, which drew heavily from the Dutch Declaration of Independence, serving as a resounding manifesto of the 13 colonies' resistance, the United States Declaration of Independence was made public. Soon after, the 13 colonial states declared independence, and a brand new nation, the United States of America, was born. It was also during the founding of the United States that the British assembled tens of thousands of troops in Halifax, with the intent to snuff out this nascent nation in its cradle. Thus began the second phase of the American Revolutionary War. From July 1776 to March 1777, American and British forces engaged in multiple clashes in key strategic areas of New York and New Jersey. In New York, where the pro-British faction held the advantage, the British enjoyed a series of victories. At one point, the American forces were in an extremely perilous situation, but just as the British were confident they could quell the rebellion within a year, devastating news from New Jersey made them frown. While pursuing the American forces in New Jersey, the British, to resolve supply issues, began requisitioning supplies from the local residents, which later escalated into looting, and even acts of rape and other violent offenses. The locals, including some pro-British sympathizers who were victims, rose up in resistance. Initially independent New Jersey militias later coordinated with the Continental Army, dealing a huge blow to the increasingly unpopular British forces. The New Jersey campaign ultimately ended in a victory for the Continental Army and militias. Afterwards, the British lost their once proud numerical advantage, while the American forces fared poorly. Compared to the British, they at least still had the advantage of continuous recruitment on their home soil. Once the military strength gap narrowed, God obviously favored the side with more spirit and courage. To the Hessian mercenaries fighting for the British, they were merely there for the job. Hardly anyone's willing to die for Britain. But for the Americans, there was no way out. There was hope ahead. While the rear was a bottomless pit, with no option but a do-or-die fight, they had no other choice. The Saratoga campaign from June to October 1777 is regarded as the turning point of the American Revolutionary War. In this battle, the American forces forced the main British army to surrender. Nearly 6,000 British soldiers were captured, including British Major General John Burgoyne. More importantly, this victory earned the United States an important bargaining chip, namely comprehensive support from France. In fact, after the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, although France saw it as a rare opportunity to weaken Britain, but in view of its disastrous defeat in the 7 Years' War, France was still wary of the powerful British Navy, and thus dared not confront Britain head-on. Since 1776, in order to weaken Britain, France began secretly aiding the United States, providing the U.S. military with a large amount of armed support. In addition, some passionate French revolutionaries also appeared on the North American battlefield. The most famous among them was Lafayette. This noble-born man brought his own troops and fought alongside the American forces against the British from 1777, contributing greatly to the War of Independence. To honor Lafayette, later generations in America named many cities and streets after him. The Lafayette statue at Manhattan's Union Square in New York has stood there since 1876, when news of the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga reached Paris. The French were amazed by the Americans' tenacity, and they realized that if Britain and America negotiated peace, they would miss the chance to defeat Britain. So they had to join the war quickly. In February 1778, King Louis XVI officially recognized American independence and formed a military alliance with them. In June of the same year, France declared war on Britain, turning the American Revolutionary War into an international conflict. Although Britain was reluctant to fight France, confident from their 7 Years' War victory, Britain believed it could defeat France again. But clearly, the British misjudged the situation. When Britain sought allies in this expanding war, they found no one willing to side with them. To counter the French threat, Britain switched to a defensive stance in North America. The American Revolutionary War entered its 3rd year, and the war began to stalemate. In 1779, another bad news came for the British, causing multiple disadvantages that year. Britain's rival Spain allied with France, and as an ally funded America. In 1780, the Netherlands also joined the anti-British camp. Although the Dutch did not send troops to fight directly in North America, this old republic provided $7 million in loans to young America, which was like a boon for the financially exhausted United States, greatly easing the rebellion crisis caused by issues with troop payments. Starting early 1781, the war began to swing in favor of the American forces. Throughout the first half of the year, the Americans scored continuous victories. The weary British began showing signs of collapse. In September, the last major land battle of the American Revolution, which was also the decisive battle, the Siege of Yorktown, broke out. After nearly 2 weeks of bombardment by the French-American Allied forces, the main British force holding Yorktown could not hold out, and on October 19th, the British deputy commander in North America, Cornwallis, surrendered nearly 8,000 British troops to the Allies. After that, although sporadic fighting continued between Britain and America, the outcome of the war was basically decided. When news of the Yorktown victory reached London, North, the head of the British cabinet, sadly said, "It's all over." The war defeat also led to the fall of North's government. In November 1782, Britain and America signed the draft of the Treaty of Paris, officially granting American independence. In the same year, the war between Britain and France also ended, although the war concluded with France's victory. Aside from gaining 2 small islands, France gained almost no substantial benefits. The war caused huge military expenses, and fiscal and political problems piled up. A great transformation was brewing in the country. America. The end of the American Revolutionary War ended an era of saying no for Americans, and after gaining independence as they wished, a new era of saying yes began. This country, full of challenges and opportunities, had to figure out how to continue to function, and what kind of country it should become. In short, many problems that Americans have never faced are now right in front of them. The real test is only just beginning.